I will now hand over to Roberta Llana, who is the co-chair of the Paris Committee on Capacity Building, who will open and introduce this webinar. Roberta, please.
Thank you, Alejandro, and welcome everyone. Thank you all participants who are joining today from all over the world to take part in this webinar, in which we will discuss the important topic of building capacity for the science policy interface. It is great to see so many of you attending, and today's event is really the first of its kind. As the name makes clear, it's a webinar which is held to follow up the discussion at the 10th Durban Forum on Capacity Building, which we held in June this year. And the Durban Forum on Capacity Building has been organized yearly for almost a decade now, gathering stakeholders with diverse background to share and discuss experiences of climate and capacity building. At COP26 and COP25 in 2019, the parties requested for the Durban Forum to align with the work of the PCCB, the Paris Committee on Capacity Building, and its annual focus areas. So this year, the PCCB focus area is building capacity to facilitate coherent implementation of nationally determined contribution in the context of national development plans. To inform our work under this focus area, we called for submissions from parties, from observers, and other relevant stakeholders earlier this year. And a key theme emerging from both these submissions, as well as during the 10th Durban Forum, was the importance of building capacity for scientific and evidence-based policy making and for mainstreaming climate and development goals into policy planning. This theme aligns with many of the key takeaways from the PCCB Knowledge to Action Days, which was a series of events in and around last COP. And this event shed light on the central role that universities and research institutions in developing countries have in enhancing climate action, alongside the role required from government and non-state actors. To further continue these discussions, we have organized this webinar to allow for a dedicated discussion on the science policy interface and how it can be strengthened to enable coherent implementation and to reach a climate and development agenda and goals. We intend for these follow-up webinars to the Durban Forum to become a recurring event. The discussions here will directly contribute to the work of the PCCB as per our work plan 2021-2024. And most importantly, however, we hope that today's event will provide you with an enhanced understanding of gaps and needs, as well as solutions and opportunities to strengthen capacities of the science policy interface. And to guide us through today's discussion, I will give the floor to our esteemed moderator, Malle Fofana. Malle works for the Global Green Growth Institute, where he is currently representative from Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso. He leads and directs the country programs and is responsible for strategic leadership and direction in these countries to achieve a strong, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth. So before Malle takes over, I just ask Alejandro if there is anything about the meeting etiquette that is still to be given to the participants, or I can give the floor to Malle.
Thank you very much, Roberta. Yes, just a couple of notes. We intend to make this webinar an interactive and participatory event with ample space for audience engagement. In a few minutes, you will get the possibility to take part in a Mentimeter exercise. And later, during the open plenary discussion, you will be able to ask questions directly to the panelists via the application Padlet for which you will also be provided with a link. This, however, means that we kindly ask you not to use the meeting chat for questions or comments to panelists, to avoid crowding out the channel and being distracted from the main discussions. Having said that, now we'll hand it over to Malle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro, for this presentation, also the kind reminder for the netiquette. So good morning, good afternoon to all the participants around the world. Welcome to this webinar on building capacity for strengthening the science policy interface. My name is Malle, as you rightly put, and I'm the country director at the Global Green Growth Institute called GGI for Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire, supporting and promoting strong, inclusive and sustainable economic growth in developing country and emerging economy. I'm very pleased today to moderate this high-level webinar hosted by the Paris Committee on Capacity Building. We all hope that we will come closer to an answer today on the following question. What does a well-functioning science policy interface that can enable actors to coherently implement and reach climate and development agenda and goals look like? This is the big question that we are looking for answer today. Well, to help us understand this and come up with some viewpoint and experience, we have three panelist speakers, and I have the honor to introduce them. I will start first, our first panelist, which is Mr. Emilio Sempris, former Minister of Environment of Panama and Director General of the Water Center for Humid Tropics at Latin America and the Caribbean. He has more than 20 years experience in international cooperation, climate change, water resources management, natural disaster responses, and natural resources modeling. Mr. Emilio, welcome again to this webinar. Our second panelist, which is Mrs. Melody Braun, Senior Staff Associate at the International Research Institute for Climate and Society, with multidisciplinary background in earth science, sustainable development, and adaptation to climate change. Her work focused on designing and support the strategy to improve integration of climate information into making process and decision-making process to increase preparedness, responses, and resilience to climate impact. Mrs. Melody Braun, welcome to this webinar. Our third and last panelist, Mrs. Hindou Oumarou Ibrahim. She's an environmental activist and member of Chad's pastoralist Mororo people. She is dedicated to the protection of all indigenous people and to value to their traditional knowledge in the fight against climate change and biodiversity protection. She's began advocating for that right since the age of 16, founding the Association of Indigenous Women and People of Chad to introduce a new income revenue activities and collaborative tools such as 3D participatory mapping to build sustainable ecosystem management and reduction of the nature-based resource conflict. Mrs. Oumarou, welcome to this webinar. In this first part of these meetings, we will hear about the experience and viewpoints on today's topics and panel discussion for about 40 minutes. Then we have a break for 5 minutes, after which we will have a 30 minutes open plenary discussion. The meeting will be closed by Marzena Chodor, PCCB Working Group 3 lead. Before, I would like to remind that we have a Padlet on which we kindly ask the participant to write their questions and comments, rather than the meeting chat. The link to the Padlet is shared in the chat now. Please use it. Before the panel start, I think we have an interesting session. We'll have to agree and to disagree at a certain point. That segment will get to conversation start. 3 segments will be, let's say, provided for the panelists to take a position audience, and you as the audience and the participant can participate via Mentimeter. The link is sent to the chat now. I don't know if we can have the Mentimeter. Thank you very much. It's chat now, so you can go to that link and use the code. There will be several statements that will be shared. You can choose your answer on a scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree. Also, panelists are similarly expected to provide a position as well, so we can also have a good conversation. So from there, I think we can start the agree and disagree session. So as you rightly see, there is a first statement when we say that science policy interface should be a one-way flow where scientists provide their findings to the policymaker without opinion and policy advocacy. And the second is need of translating scientific knowledge into policy relevant knowledge is greater than need to translate policy into relevant knowledge. Integrating marginalized groups in the research process always results in more equitable policy. So those three statements, people are strongly agree and strongly disagree. Very interesting. Good. So we see a lot of position that the participants are giving during that Menti exercise that give us really your viewpoint, and also the panelists will discuss that, and those issues and concerns will be raised as well to see exactly what is the best way to a capacity building. We can resolve that. That will give us one conversation that we would like to start now, which is about the challenges and the barriers, right? We all know that the science policy interface in many ways in which scientific and policy makers and other communicate to develop knowledge for policy and research who are really involved with the key voice on the conversation, who are the marginalized stakeholders who currently are not being heard. So there's a lot of question about the interface between science and policy, which kind of solution that we put in place. But I think it's good for us to really understand and hear from the different panelists the challenge and the barriers to make this thing happen. I would like to just put one general question here, and we'll invite our guests to give their thought and view on that. The first general question I will ask here is that what are the main capacity-related challenges, gaps, and needs to formulating and implementing science-based climate and development policy in the current manner? Which is really important for us to get that insight from the different. And I will invite Mr. Emilio. I would like to hear your thought on that. For that point of view, if you can share your experience as well as the current challenges and barrier that you think that was to share to different participants. Mr. Emilio, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, all. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Yeah, I would like to share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Not yet, I think. Just a second. Yes, now we have it.
Thank you very much. I first would like to also thank the Secretariat and the Paris Committee for this opportunity. These are very exciting times for climate change and the capacity building, the global capacity building agenda under the Durban Forum. So, given the limited time, I would like to address three main points that I wholeheartedly believe are a key consideration to advancing the science policy integration towards decision making at both the international and the national level. So basically, I just have three thesis statements that I hope that trigger some further discussion so that we can move forward. The first is regarding the scale and scope of capacity building needs. As you all know, the issue of climate change can be easily overwhelming, both to the scientific community and, of course, to the policy community. So we have to find ways to address at different scales these needs, and make sure that while addressing the scale, we also fine-tune the scope of the intervention, because it's not the same to develop a science for an issue that has to be addressed globally than to develop science for issues that need to necessarily be addressed at the local level, particularly in indigenous communities where their language or their dialects in some cases are not do not have access to the scientific knowledge. So in that regard, there is a big challenge that we need to address to make sure that we fine-tune the scale and the scope of the interventions. Just to give you a small example, at the community level, this is a map of divided into, and it's not traditionally divided into global municipalities and prefectures. And at the local level, for instance, communities do not yet realize that forest fires are related in a way to climate change. So this type of issues, when we come up with science to interact with policies at the local level, we probably have to fine-tune the language. We have to readdress or reconfigure our message so that it can make it to the policy level. I mean, to the policy implementers at the local level. So the second issue that I find interesting is the capacity building continuity. The international science is very strong. Climate change is the only global issue with at least 5 intergovernmental reports, scientific reports. Yet there is a broken link between what's happening in the scientific community and the policy development community. So the continuity in some cases is affected by these cycles in government policy continuity. And this chart it talks about the changes in government in some developed countries. But if you were to see this in a developing country, you will find more dotted lines. I mean, more dotted lines, and those dots correlate strongly with a change in the interaction between science and policy. So our community has to find ways to make sure that there is a continuity between the science and policy communities to address capacity building. And often you see that governments, particularly in developing countries, they take a lot longer time. When I remember when I served as national climate change coordinator in the 90s, we, in our first national communication, we agreed on a list of projects that we need to implement based on IPCC the first assessment report, and we submitted our national communication in 2001. So in 98, 99, we put together this list of projects, and we, for instance, we agreed on a project to relocate an indigenous community from inland to mainland. It's a low-lying archipelago in our country. So it took us as country about 20 years to implement the project. The project we formulated in 97 and we started implementation in 2017, almost 20 years later. When I look back, I realized that it took a lot of time to establish this science policy dialogue between the indigenous communities, the government, and the academia in the country. It went through, for instance, the indigenous cosmovision. At the end, the chief of the tribes agreed to convince its constituency to move to mainland and to address all the cultural issues in between. So it's a very lengthy process. And if there is no political continuity, there is no science continuity in the message, and there is no interaction, that 20-year process could probably be a longer process. So the third issue that I'm seeing, and it's actually an emerging issue in science and policy, is the interaction with the sustainable finance community. You all may be well aware, both as a member of the academia or member of the science and community, and actually member of the policy decision bodies, that uninformed financial resources could enhance risks to climate change impacts and delay adaptation, and probably turn into maladaptation projects implemented. So this forum needs to take into account the inflow of financing coming from, for instance, the sustainable finance movement. Here is a chart with the latest number from the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance. Yep. Those monies are coming in, and those monies, they probably they don't have the knowledge, or they don't have the capacity needed to address. So regardless of the good intention of those resources, we may end up implementing projects that enhance our vulnerabilities to climate change. So those are the three topics that I wanted to bring to the table, and hope that we engage in further discussion. Thank you very much.
This is fantastic, Mr. Emilio. I think you said, some concern, as you mentioned, there's issues and the lack of, having a three-party dialogue between, the scientific, the policy decision maker, and also some lack the community as well. As you mentioned, also there's a lack of continuity, right? When you build something in the science base, they need some kind of continuity to help to maintain that, research and interaction with the policy more sustainable, and the lack also the access to finance. But I think there is a main question around that when we look at these, statement that you made. There is some capacity build that would be need there. For example, when you talk about this sustainable finance, is about how we scientific need to have more capacity building on how to write proposal, how to have the access to the finance, how to be more, let's say, driven by that element. When you think about three-party dialogue, do we need more capacity building on the policy, institutional arrangement? I think there's a lot of questions that will be really need to be triggered there. And I know that there's a lot of let's say people saying that scientific are putting, warning us since a lot of decades, right? And policymakers are not making the decision in certain point. And I know Malle Braun is really, supporting, designing and supporting strategy to improve the integration of climate information to a decision-making process to increase the preparedness and responses to the resilient climate impact. So Malle, I would like to hear your thought, and what are the challenges and what are the barriers? Why policymakers sometimes do not consider the scientific, and what is the, the best way, what is really the challenges, and what are the different, let's say, support that would be needed for that? I will hear your thoughts on that, because I think you work a lot on that. Please share your view on that, really answering for all the participants.
Thank you, Malle. Thank you for having me. I hope you can hear me.
Crystal clear, yeah.
Great. So yeah, absolutely. I think those are really important points that you raised. I would say, building on what Emilio was saying, that we all agree there's clearly this lack of collaboration and lack of really mutual understanding between the scientific community and the policymakers, and also the people affected by the policies. So that's something that we see a lot, and it's not just, I would say this disconnect happens horizontally and vertically. So vertically between, those communities and the people on the ground, but also horizontally, one of the challenges that we see is that within ministries, there are often disconnects between, for example, the ministry or the department in charge of producing climate information and the ministries in charge of developing policies in different specific sectors that are needing that climate information. And so very often there are not a lot of resources that go to the meteorological departments. And I think that's really a challenge that we all have to take into consideration, because we rely on them. And very often there's a bit of a bottleneck here, because the production of good quality climate information based on best available science very often relies on a small team of people who are really, very busy producing that information and don't necessarily have the bandwidth to interact with the science, with the policymakers, and with the practitioners as much as we would like to. So I think there's a lack of institutional mechanisms for that collaboration to happen. There's a lack of maybe focus and resources and recognition of the work of some of those meteorological departments. And then, yes, there's definitely a need for really foundational capacity building on climate risk management, because and that has to go both ways, right? So we want the scientists to better understand what are the needs on the ground and how can policies support that, and then how can science support the policies and the practice on the ground to go towards more, to strengthen adaptation and resilience. So the scientists have something to learn here, because one-way science where products are developed without an understanding of the needs of people who are going to use it, we know this doesn't work. And then on the other hand, we also need capacity building of policymakers and of decision makers to understand the information that's available, but also understand, improve their ability to communicate what they need. We see that a lot of policies include information at very long timescales, looking at climate change scenarios, end of century type of information. And that's something that's relatively accessible, and then a lot of people consider that, this is what they can use. But when the policies are meant to support people who have to make decisions about what they're going to do in the next season, the long-term information about what's happening at the end of the century is not really that helpful. So there are a lot of other types of climate information that exist that can be, better suited to a lot of the climate decisions that people have to make now. And so there's really a need for interdisciplinary capacity building and interdisciplinary dialogue between those different communities to move towards that.
Just Melody, just one clarification on that part. Are you meaning that the scientific have also to know about policy, or being more into policy recommendation side as well, understand how that work? At the same time, also policymakers should understand also how scientific is working. I mean, how we can create that link, right? That bridge, because when I hear so far, it's mean that there's a huge gap between policy decision making and everyone have his own word, right? But there's no connection, right? So are you suggesting that the scientific have to be more into policy recommendation step, further, right? Their work, or not? Just hear your thought on that.
Sure. Well, I mean, we can't expect scientists to start developing policies. That's not their job. But I think in order to produce policy relevant science, there's a need to understand, at least to some extent, what the needs are. And I think because a lot of the meteorological departments are, they have their own mandate. Their mandate is to produce climate information. So there's no way to expect that they will be able to talk to every policymaker in every sector and understand that. But that's also why it's really important to have intermediaries in place.
Yeah. Allah يسلم يبارك فيك الله يسلم يبارك فيك الله يسلمك
جيناك someone would like to join. Okay. Go ahead, Mela. Sorry for that. I think you're on mute. Melody.
Yeah.
Yes.
You hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's also the reason we want scientists to have at least a certain level of understanding of the kind of information that's relevant for policies in different sectors. And so we need that exchange where they can learn from policymakers, but also I think that's where it's really important to have intermediaries in place who can understand a bit of both worlds and who can facilitate that dialogue and help with that translation of information from both sectors.
You mentioned one point, and I think it's a good, transition to Hindou. That is sometimes there's a lack of collaboration, right, between policy, scientific, also to a certain level of people. And I think Hindou will have a large experience because he's really pushing to have indigenous people to be involved, not involved in the sense of being beneficiary, but also involved in the sense that we have to also use some practices, right, that can help us really to not build the science based on some of the scientific routine, but also there are some, let's say, past way of thinking, way of doing from our ancestors that can be used as well for the climate information. So Hindou, I would like to hear your thought on that, and also welcome again to this webinar. Please share your experience on that and also the challenges and barriers.
Thank you very much, Malle. It's really a great pleasure seeing you here, and hi, everyone. So as you all know that from indigenous peoples, when we talk about science, it is very particular, not the modern science where people go to school and get their PhDs or do the research and just write a paper. It is the science that we live, grow up with, and we pass it through one generation to another one. So how we can talk about the broader science knowledge in the environment that can protect the climate change and also that can restore the biodiversity loss. So that's why for the indigenous peoples, when we talk about capacity building and all, we say we're already coping with it because we are passing those information from generation to generation. So how we can link it with the PCCB work and also to the policymakers and also the scientists. So we already know that we get the Article 7.5 of the Paris Agreement that recognize the indigenous people's knowledge are so relevant to climate adaptation and also mitigations because of the decisions 135 that create the local communities and indigenous people's platform. So we are so grateful for that because we start working on a 2 years work plan that ended now, where we implement the activities and seeing where the traditional knowledge of the indigenous peoples can be also put it together in order to help the policy decisions. For us, it is not only at the international level, but Melody, you say it very well, how at the national level we can put together those knowledge who can give immediate response to the peoples. So those are the knowledge people want from day-to-day life, but also the projection of 100 years is important, but how about today? And when we focus on to the target of 1.5 degree and all we wanted to have those science reacting now. So I give you just some example of how we did that as indigenous peoples. And when we are doing that, so we always do that through the protocol of the indigenous peoples, how we are working with each communities of scientists or of politicians that are doing the planning of climate change. So one of the examples we had the indigenous communities and local communities work with the government and scientists to enhance the participation of indigenous peoples into the NDCs and NAPS documents. So we did, Malle, I'm going to give the example of the Burkina Faso because that was so very good examples. So we had the workshop firstly between the indigenous communities where we can gather all the information and where we can also put the communities in a safe place because it is not any space where you can come and have the knowledge and practice of indigenous peoples and go writing a paper, but how the indigenous peoples willing to share those knowledges and which knowledge they're willing to share, which one they wanted to keep for their own communities, because it is also issue of identity, issue of land, issue of water access, etc. So when we finalize with all this, then we get through the meeting with the scientists to discuss with the scientists, see what did they have to give like the early warning system during the years, because this is the most important information that can help the community to plan the agriculture or the pastorals movement. Otherwise, they are getting into conflict because of the resources that's shrinking. And then when we share the information with the scientists that build the narrative to have a broader meeting with the politicians, and where the politicians come and see the collaboration between the indigenous peoples and the scientists together, and that helps them to say where will be the window that we can include indigenous peoples and local communities to participate in designing all the policies that we are having to get up. So we did that in Burkina Faso, in Chad with the meteorological scientists, in Benin, and then we had a regional consultations between those groups to discuss and see how we can put it together in a regional scale. So those kind of capacity need a different skill. So how the capacity will be built from indigenous peoples to scientists and to the policymakers, and how also the capacity building may be from the scientists to the indigenous peoples, because we need also the technologies and we need also the science information to put all our oral information in a live, in a written way in order to share with others. So those examples are so practical for us, and we need to see how the PCCB can get that into the interactions of the capacity building's work.
Thank you very much, Hindou. We hear your voice. I mean, this is really clear. And when I hear you speaking, there's one common concept coming always. It's about sharing, right? It's meaning that everyone have a knowledge, from indigenous people to the policy makers to the scientific. Making that platform, that information would be shared between those actors is really important. And that question of the South-South cooperation or South-North cooperation also is really important as well. How we can make that happen, not only at the national level, at the regional level, as well as at the continental level. It's about also being more inclusive, right? The process should integrate all people, not left someone behind, but also about indigenous people, also on the gender dynamic, right? When you say science policy, what are the place of gender there, right? So there's a lot of challenge and barriers, and I would like here now some of the key opportunity solution and best practice linked to the capacity building for strengthening the capacity of improving science policy to really have a climate and development goal agenda. I would like to recall Melody here. If you can give us some, best practices of a solution that was given or used in the past to capacity building that come up with great result when it's come to make the link between science policy interface.
Sure, thank you, Malle, and actually thank you, Hindou, as well, for your great points. I'm going to build on that. So yeah, I think in our experience, the most important thing in order to build capacity building programs that actually help develop climate products that are useful is just to have this interdisciplinary collaboration. There needs to be a co-production process where the users of the information are, absolutely included from the very beginning of the conversation. And I think it goes the same way with policymakers. If there's a need, if we want policymakers to better understand the climate information that exists and be better able to integrate that into policies that will support adaptation, we need to have them included in the conversation from the beginning. So what we've been doing at IRI is we've been working with partners in different countries to develop academies for climate services, which have as a first function the ability to create an interdisciplinary space where we can bring all these people together. So on the policy side, on the science side, and then on the practitioner side, and have a discussion, a mutual, like a dialogue where they can mutually exchange about the kind of impacts that people are facing, the kind of solutions that they already have, the knowledge that they already have, and they can self-identify, what they think is missing and what kind of capacity they think they need. And then based on that, we can co-produce capacity building programs that are tailored to the specific needs of specific communities. Now, obviously the challenge is that this requires funding, and so it's easy to develop those kinds of initiatives under-funded projects. But going back to what Emilio was saying, we also want to make sure there's continuity after a project ends, after a government changes, etc. So we really think that universities are a key partner in that, because universities stay. They stay after changes of government, they stay after the end of projects. So we want to make sure that these initiatives include local universities. There are networks of local universities working together. There are South-South collaboration networks with universities. So what we really believe in is building the capacity of stakeholders on the ground in organizations that are going to stay in place so that they can in turn transfer that knowledge to other stakeholders, and that's a sustainable initiative. And obviously they need funding as well. So one of the challenges is that a lot of projects don't necessarily allow to fund local partners in southern countries. So that's something that I think we have to work together on solving. But really, yeah, we really try to foster this idea of climate services academies where we convene stakeholders all together and we jointly develop capacity building programs, and we identify who are the different partners in the different countries that have the expertise to deliver capacity building on a specific topic that is demand-based, and then how we can collaborate to build climate services curriculums altogether that can then be hosted in local universities, and that where the knowledge can keep being transmitted after the end of projects.
Well noted. I think collaboration is key, as you mentioned, from the different, experts from the different discipline, from the different environment and also stages, policymaker, from university, CSO, civil society. I think collaboration is key to make it happen. And I would like also to hear Mr. Emilio I know that you are famous Minister of Environment, and also you talk about continuity when it's come to building the capacity as well. And you had a chance also to lead a water center for the human trafficking in Latin America. I would like to hear your thought over your 20 years experience. Can you share us like a best practice or solution that you see that would be worth to reconduct or scaling in a larger scale, or also share to the participant that can be used widely in terms of capacity building to make that science and policy interface works well?
Yeah, just one lesson learned throughout these 20 years, and is that I learned that since this topic continues to be fairly new, government officials are the first to come to have access to such a new information, new science. Then government officials tend to conduct workshops that only invite government officials. So after trials and tribulations, I realized that no matter what you do in capacity building, make sure that when you are training individuals, make sure that you are training individuals from all sectors, from the communities, from the academia, from the private sector, from the associations, and try to build a community, build a community of local knowledge. That community of local knowledge will eventually turn into a living entity, and it will enhance its capacity beyond the resources that are allocated to that community, so that we avoid the bicycle effect, that you're riding the bike, but when you stop financing, the bike stops. So you need to build community, and I fully agree with Melody and Hindou on this regard.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. And I would call now Hindou, if you can share us one of the best practices that you saw so far, or the involvement of indigenous people that you can share now before we go to the break. Please go ahead.
Sure. So I think the best practice is always at the national level, as I said. So, in Chad, we work with the meteorological department. So we did take them to the communities who are very far from all this technology, who do not know anything about pollutions. So the nomadic pastoralists, they went there, they sit there, they discuss with the communities. And at the end of the day, they finalized by creating an applications as scientists, how they can combine the traditional knowledge and the science knowledge to send the SMS to the communities who are the farmers to see where they can get the crops done. So this is really a concrete way of how they can collaborate. And lastly, we do have an activity 1 and 8 of the facilitative working group that's going to happen in this COP26, where we invited a knowledge holders who can come from the communities and sit down with the negotiators. And of course, the scientists also, I think they will be there in the room to discuss about how we can better share all those knowledge and make them in practices for the climate change adaptation and mitigation.
Thank you very much, Hindou, and thanks very much also to Emilio and Melody. I think we will take a time for 5 minutes breaks. I would let Alejandro to introduce us to that, but after that 5 minutes, we'll have a plenary discussion where we go more in detail and question and responses. Alejandro, over to you.
Thank you very much, Malle, Emilio, Melody, and Hindou for a most insightful discussion. I'm sure we're all now very curious to hear from the audience are the questions to you, as well as additional views and perspective on the discussion. Please remember that you can post your questions using the Padlet, and maybe we can send the link again in the chat. And now we will have a short 5-minute break. So see you in 5 minutes for the open plenary discussion. Thank you.
Let me try. So thank you, everyone. I was almost sleeping, so it was 5 minutes, very cool in a sense. Thank you, everyone, for staying and waiting to the next part of the agenda. We will have 30 minutes that will be mostly having a question to the to the panelists, and also trying also to get more insight on a couple of things, and also this question that you raised to the Padlet, we'll also raise it to the different panelists. So the first question I have is for Emilio. There's one question there, is about let's say, when you explain on your speech, and there's a lack of sustainability, and there's one question is that only finance can create more sustainability in that area? Just very rapid answer, because there's a lot of question for you, and then I will go on the second one, please.
No, yeah, definitely not. But what I was trying to refer to was that to the fact that there is new resources coming to the table, and those resources are coming from the private sector. In some cases, those resources are not climate change educated. So we need to put in place some sort of capacity building scheme to train those new resources.
Yeah, and there's one interesting question as a farmer minister. There is one question saying that any thoughts on how to bridge the difference in planning horizons between politicians who think of the election cycle and things that require sustained attention, like addressing climate change? What is your thought on that?
Yeah, my thought on that is that when you talk to politicians, to high-ranking officials, talk to them in terms of the legacy. Don't talk to them on what you're gonna get in the immediate present or the near future, but talk to them in terms of the legacy. Say, we're doing this project so that in 20 years, you are proud of what you did. That's the only hope that I see here. So you have to sell the big picture and turn them into visionaries. And as a technician, you have to build those skills. Otherwise, they're gonna run for the next candidate they have in front of them, so that they make it to the news. So try to sell the best possible legacy or big picture to the decision makers.
In the last, and I think it's last question I have for you is, there's one question is, how should scientific better communicate climate information to policymaker? For you, what is the best way?
The best way is to take advantage of the timing for the issues. For instance, there is a big hurricane happening in the Caribbean. You don't go to the Caribbean Minister of the Environment to talk about a different topic. So talk about something that he can build upon and say, okay, this is the right time to launch a Caribbean-wide initiative for the next 20 years on addressing impacts of hurricanes. So if you don't do that, you're gonna be ignored.
Absolutely, absolutely agree. And I come to the comprehension, and then I would like invite Melody and Braun on that question. There was a question of better communicating, but also the complexity of data and scientific report, right? Well, the question is why it's hard for policymakers to understand scientific report. Tell us about that.
Oh, because you know, when I served as Minister of Environment, I was in charge of 85 multilateral environmental agreements. So your attention span is so reduced that you have to be able to digest everything. So you don't have time to spend hours on a single matter. So you have to be in a decision-making mode 24/7. So scientists, they have to take that into account and try to frame the message so that a decision can be taken.
Fantastic, fantastic. Melody, can you just jump on that and share your experience as you were working closely on that, scientific data and scientific report, please?
Sure. Yeah, I think as Emilio said, decision makers are very busy. They have their own mandates and they don't necessarily have the time to explore, read scientific details, scientific reports in detail. So, for example, if you look at the last IPCC report that came out on August 9th, there's always a summary for policymakers. But if policymakers don't have the time or the mandate to go and study that, I mean, there's not going to be a high likelihood that they're going to integrate it. So that's why I think we're going back to the importance of having in-person exchanges where the science can be broken down into pieces and into something that directly relates to specific policies, specific decisions that policymakers have to make. And, we're in a crisis, so we really need to be able to use all the climate information that is out there, because we really need everything we have, everything we can get to solve this crisis. So there is an interest from policymakers to be able to understand that, but they don't necessarily have the time, and they don't necessarily view it as their mandate to go out and do that work. So I think that's why we're going back to the importance of having these interdisciplinary in-person dialogue, like Hindou was also mentioning is happening in West Africa, for example.
Yeah. But out of the complexity of data, I think this is my favorite question about gender. What is the place of gender in this scientific context?
That's a very, very broad, very tough question. Well, I mean, in my experience, we're working, IRI is working with, we have a lot of scientists in-house, we're working with meteorological departments all around the world. I mean, there's clearly a vast majority of male climate scientists, so I think we definitely need more women in that field, but also I think it's also really important to not just look at gender within the sphere of the climate scientists, but also, constantly be thinking about, when we talk about what are the needs of the people on the ground, what are the decisions that are made, what are the needs for climate information, it's also really important to distinguish the needs that men might have and the needs that women might have, because we all know obviously that they're responsible for very different activities, livelihood activities, so they might just have different needs for climate information. And so how do we bring not just men that are often more recognized, for example, in farming communities, men are often more recognized as farmers because they're landowners, but how do we bring women into those conversations? And I mean, there are a lot of people doing amazing work on that all over the world, but it's a complex topic. I think it's both, making sure that we take that into account when we look at the needs for climate information, because they are different, and then also, how can we bring more women into science? And there's a whole educational aspect to this. How do we get women to be interested, to get high level scientific positions? I would say in the interface between science and policy and practice, in my experience, but I don't have numbers, I would say it's maybe a little bit more balanced. But definitely in science, there's a big need for more women. So if you're listening, and you're interested in science and you're a young woman, go for it.
Perfect, fantastic. Professor Mizan, I see you raised your hand. I will just pursue with Hindou and come back to you for your question, would you don't mind. So Hindou, I have one question that's linked to the knowledge for the local community. People saying that the knowledge is very rich, right? And how sustained community for century, there's no doubt for that. But they're saying that this very context specific and hence could be applied in universally. So how can we address this issue to bring that knowledge to a larger level?
Of course. So firstly, we need to set up a process of how all the peoples can recognize just the indigenous people's knowledge without saying we have to confirm it or we have to double check it, because indigenous people's knowledge are so broad. And most of our knowledge are in our mother tongue. You cannot translate it into French, English, Arabic, or whatever, that people can just write it down as the scientists or modern scientists that used to. So how the science, as now the IPCC recognize the indigenous people's knowledge, and also we are working with the IPBS, so how all the scientists can just recognize the indigenous knowledge value and include them without questioning. And by understanding, it is a matter of time, because we don't have time to do all checking or whatever. So secondly, I think it is very important also that indigenous peoples get their own capacity and put down their knowledge as they wish to put it down, and share it also with the generation that they want, because most of our knowledge are oral. So I do this work by doing the participatory mapping, where the community can put the knowledge in this way and they can share it with the scientists. So it is not the science that can inform indigenous peoples about the climate change, but it is the indigenous peoples that live with all this change every day who can inform the scientists how it can work and how they can restore the land.
You talk about information, and there's one question that linked to that. They're asking that who between the policymaker and the scientific may share efficient climate information with the local community. What is your thought on that?
I think it is the opposite. It is not the scientists who can inform the indigenous peoples, not the policymakers who can inform the indigenous peoples about the climate change. It is those indigenous peoples who live and experience the climate change every day, every second of their life, who should inform the scientists and the policymakers. So that's why also we need to change this system. It is not that because we went to school, we are more in a good place and we are more informed, we have to go back and inform the community. We need to listen from the communities. And when we listen from them, we can build better policies. When we listen from them, we can build a better science that can help to change their life. So let us think in opposite side, not always in the same system that never work.
Thank you very much, Hindou. I will open and ask Professor Minza if you can ask your question to the panel just very quickly so they can respond to that. Professor, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Yes. You know, there is a huge disconnect between climate science and climate policy, both internationally and nationally. And I think that the scientists lack a policy literacy, and the policymakers lack scientific literacy. So once this literacy can be enhanced on both sides, then they will feel interested to have dialogues. And I'm very encouraged to hear the very strong voice of Hindou, because particularly for adaptation, it is the local learning, local experiences, experiential learning that can teach the scientists, because adaptation is local and regional. There is no big data on adaptation. For generation local data, we need to work with the communities, and that data will speak for themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this statement. And there was also this link to the question. I'm going to go back again to Mr. Emilio. This one question is, you know, how we build the capacity then now. What is how we then build the capacity to make more useful science policy interface. We heard a lot of best practices, you know, on experience, but also what are the, when you have the option to say three things, right, that can help us to build the capacity to make that more sustainable, what are the capacities that need to be built?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, and in my opinion, it all comes down to what you want to accomplish. And often you see that international cooperation projects, they have a very small budget for public awareness and outreach. And for instance, what Hindou said, politicians have a hard time to talk to communities. Scientists have a hard time to talk to communities. So you have to identify the local leaders, and then through them build a circle of trust around. And that happened to us with the indigenous community in the archipelago. We were aware that they were gonna be floated and lose their livelihoods. But it wasn't until we realized that our message wasn't getting across that we needed to talk to the chief of the tribes. And then they convinced their people through the cosmovision that things started moving along. And the same happened in other realms. We have to find ways to identify the better intermediaries of knowledge and information. And not necessarily you have to have a diploma or a degree, but you have to have the social network, the social mesh in the community. And then around that, you build trust.
Perfect. And there's one question among those. I mean, there's a lot of conversation topics that you mentioned. You mentioned sometimes it's good to have a partner, right? And you mentioned university. We mentioned as well CSO and the role of youth, right? And it's really important. So Melody, I would like to hear your thought on how CSO or the youth can have, you know, strong capacity. What is the type of capacity they will need to really play their role as advocacy, as well as relying the information to the policymaker or to the community?
Thank you, Malle. Well, I mean, I think the youth, it's amazing to see how engaged and how passionate the youth are these days on the issues of solving the climate crisis. And we see them showing up at every level and in every sector of society at the moment. So obviously, as Hindou was saying, we have to start with the integration of the youth that are at the part of the communities at the forefront of the climate crisis, and like here, what are their concerns? What do they feel like they need to be able to be actors of that movement? I feel like the youth, like what we hear that's coming up from the dialogues that the youth are having is very focused on interdisciplinarity. It's very focused on they're really trying to understand. They really have this ability to try to understand each of those communities and try to bring them together. So I think the youth can be an agent of sort of unification in that field, but also I just think it's our role to just try to include the youth at the local level when we talk with communities about what they're facing, in the science when we have youth that are interested in pursuing a science career, at the interface when we have people who say, well, I'm not really good in math, but I really want to work in science. I really want to work on climate change. Like there's so many other careers. So I think it's really our job to start quite early on, like, developing education programs to really get them to understand the whole range of options that are out there. But it's also then our job to recognize, to hire them, to keep them hired, to give them responsibilities, to give them access to the table, because very often they're still seen as advisors, but not really given the responsibilities that they're seeking.
Thank you very much, Melody. Hindou, for just 1 minute, 1 minute to answer to that specific question. When we look at there's the information that you mentioned for the community base, right? But the information and the knowledge they have is not written somewhere, right? What is the way or the capacity that need to be built there to really have that information and the knowledge from our ancestor to be accessible to everyone?
The easy response is just to give them the capacity of finance, and they will do their own project. So as I taught you, when I do the 3D participatory mapping from the community who didn't went to school, who do not know how to write or read, they can come and map, design all the knowledge that they have. And this knowledge, we can capture it digitally, and it can stay and be shared with everyone, and even for them own generation to keep it. So just to invest on technology innovations of the community, and we can do that ourselves.
Perfect. We have 5 minutes left, and I would like to give the opportunity for each of the member of the panelists to give of 1 minute to give the key takeaways. What are the key takeaways that they would like to share to all the participants that they have to keep in mind when they will be at the end of this panel? So I would like to start with Emilio. Just give your key takeaways in 1 minute.
Yep. Thank you, Malle. The role of women is key, is pivotal. More and more, I see that women are becoming entrepreneurs at the local level. So if you identify those women that move the communities, put you hard into it, because they will never fail. So that's I got from what Hindou and Melody said. So that's a key takeaway. And the second, you have to frame the message to the policymakers. You have to even frame the message to the scientists, so that we are on the same board. Because no matter how much science you do, no matter how policies you do, things have to happen in the ground. And if in the ground you're not speaking the same language, nothing is going to happen.
Perfect. Hindou, over to you. I think yours on mute. Yeah, good. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think one of the takeaway is we need all the solutions to fasten the climate change that we are facing now. And indigenous people's knowledge are also a science that already confirmed. So we need the capacity building who can go both sides. We can build the capacity of the policymakers and scientists, and vice versa, they can build our capacity. Let us be in partnership. We can exchange those knowledges, and we can make the solutions as active as soon for the peoples that are experiencing climate change. So we are ready to do that through the facilitated working group and through our own 7 socio-cultural regions with protocols. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Melody, over to you.
Thanks. Well, I would say that first we need to recognize the vast amount of information that exists that can really help us develop stronger, more robust climate adaptation strategies, and we need to make a better use of that. We need to recognize that without interdisciplinary collaboration, we're not going to go as far as we need to, and so we have to really, break those silos for real, including the users of that climate information, so the people that are on the ground. As Hindou was saying, we have to listen to them, listen to what they feel like they need. Also, as I was saying earlier, within governments, we have to give more recognition to the people who are producing that information, because without them, we're not going to be able to go as far and as fast as we need. And we need to just work together to develop these curriculums that, like each of there are experts in all these different communities that are aware of what's missing. And we just need to be able to create these curriculums where each of these experts can bring one aspect of it, and together we can develop something that's interdisciplinary, that's accessible online. Now so many things are happening online with COVID, so we can also create curriculums that are accessible for people wherever they are, without necessarily having to have the resources to be in one place for training. But really, I think it's this sort of gathering of expertise and understanding of those different sectors to really create something together, because otherwise all the projects are working in silos, developing their own thing and checking their boxes and duplicating efforts, and so we're missing the opportunity.
Yeah, we're missing the opportunity, as you rightly put. As you mentioned, there is the lack of, let's say, communication between the different actors, in a sense that everyone have a knowledge, but how we can create that bridge between the policymaker and the news people, and also the scientific. That's one aspect that I heard so far from this conversation. The second thing also I hear is that we need to have a collaborative approach and integration of interdisciplinary approach, right? Having everyone from the different disciplinary sharing their knowledge, and having that maybe in the platform, and also not avoiding having a top-down approach, but a bottom-up approach as well. Indigenous people can teach scientific can teach the indigenous, and then the same way, right? So how we can create that bridge between those two and building the capacity on, there can be top-down capacity building, there can be bottom-up capacity building as well. And I think this is really important, as you mentioned on that one. Gender comes again in the youth as well, because it's really important to have that be more gender sensitive, right? And I'm glad that we have 2 panelists out of 1 woman, so this is great. And I think that's really important that when we having that orientation, understand how we can build more capacity of the gender to be more sensitive and well taken in the decision making, the policy as well. And the other things that was come out during that conversation as well is that the scientific have to find a way, right? It's not about just giving the scientific report, but also trying to make sure that the information is digestible by the policy maker or policy decision. And the role to do that is either the scientific can step and play that role. Also use intermediary actors like CSO. They're doing advocacy for them. They're doing the role community-based as well, association so far, doing a certain element that linked to that. The other element is mentioned is like the institutional mechanism, right? That can create and maintain the sustainability of work. It's not about having a cycle of 5 years when a policy orientation, and after every 5 years, if election, you have to start from scratch. We have to have building the capacity at the international level, so we have at least the sustainability and continuity of the work that link to the science and policy interface. And that's something that we have to develop. South-South collaboration from universities, CSO, and scientific should be also more, emphasized, and North-South collaboration as well to integrate that particular element for that. So there's a lot of rich ideas, break practice and solution that was given by the panelists. I would like to thank you again for that. That was really interesting, and it will help us for us to really have something and made to build a new program on that under the Paris group capacity building. And I would like to give the floor to Marzena Shodor, the PCC Working Group 3 lead, to give us the closing and next step as well. Marzena, over to you.
Thank you so much, Malle, and thank you all our panelists, Emilio, Melody, and Hindou, for finding time and joining this, I think, very useful webinar. Thanks to all of you in the audience, and I think you have all certainly contributed to making this talk very interesting and inspiring. We hope that discussions today provided useful impulses to you in your work, as well as to discussions in the UNFCCC process, including in the negotiations on capacity building. A summary report of the webinar will be prepared and shared shortly after we conclude. The findings from the discussion today will feed into the work of the PCCB. Under our current work plan, we are collecting, reviewing and sharing experiences, good practices and lessons learned on climate capacity building in developing countries. Another main part of our work entails awareness raising, communications and stakeholder engagement in and outside the convention. Right now we are planning the third capacity building hub at COP in 26 in Glasgow, which will be a space for various stakeholders to showcase and share their knowledge on climate capacity building. Submissions to host an event at the hub closed yesterday, but we nevertheless invite all of you to participate, either if you are at the COP personally or to join us virtually. Many of the events will touch upon the important topics discussed here today. We will have one thematic day dedicated to our PCCB 2021 focus area, which may be of particular interest for you who attended this webinar today. I also want to encourage you to become part of the PCCB network if you are not part of it already. This is one of the ways in which we work with connecting and engaging capacity building stakeholders. We have many members of the network who represent research as well as policy and intermediary positions, and welcome everyone to join us so that we can continue discussions just like this one. We hope to connect with you there at the Capacity Building Hub and our other upcoming events, including the next Durban Forum Follow-up webinar, which will be held later this year or early next year. A link to a recording of today's event will be posted on the website. We would also greatly appreciate if you would take a few minutes to fill out the post-event survey, which will help us to make future events as good as possible. The link is posted in the chat. We encourage you all to share your views on today's event via your social media accounts with the hashtags UNFCCC and PCCB. With this, the only thing left to me to say is on behalf of the PCCB and the UNFCCC capacity building team, thank you very much for joining us today and hope to see you at our future events. Goodbye, everyone.